Vikings did whatever the hell they wanted. They were stealth and ruthless seafaring Norsemen and women who disregarded conventional battlefield tactics, methods, and customs of the time. These attributes weren't seen as cowardly acts of warfare, they were regarded as smart tactics in a successful pillaging. Today we're exploring what it was really like on a Viking raid. Let's understand why these Norsemen turned to raiding and pillaging. It wasn't because they loved violence and it was something to pass the time. Viking raids were a matter of survival. But it wasn't always like that, though. Early in the Viking Age, between the 8th and 9th century, Vikings fought for honor. They were made up of small tribes that didn't adhere to law, authority, or religion, and violence was used as a way to settle disputes with other tribes. Eventually, defending the tribe's honor and appealing to their gods of war became secondary. Vikings soon began to go on raids to acquire wealth and material goods. They often targeted Christian monasteries in Britain. Why? Because these monasteries were easy prey for the Vikings. The defenseless monks who inhabited them were sitting friar ducks. A tribe of Vikings as small as 30 warriors could take down a monastery without breaking a sweat. As a matter of fact, the beginning of the Viking Age is normally regarded as June 8, 793 AD, when the first documented Viking attack took place at a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne in northern England. Alcuin, a scholar in Charlemagne's court at the time, wrote of that particular raid,
"Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we now have suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of the saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets."
But to the Vikings, a monastery was too good to pass up. They were filled to the rafters with treasures like gold, silver, jewels, and books. Monasteries were also a valuable source for food, drink, cattle, clothes, and tools. A Viking pillaging a Christian monastery was like raiding a Bed Bath & Beyond, except without all the patchouli fragrance. The fact that Viking raids were aimed at churches and monasteries was regarded as particularly horrifying at the time. No one was safe from the Vikings, not even men of God. When Vikings weren't raiding monasteries, they were battling the armies of various countries and sometimes other Vikings. These fights weren't as simple as punking some monks, though. These battles required strategy. Vikings relied on the element of surprise. Vikings were well known for ambushing their targets by hiding in the woods and lying in wait for their opponents as they walked along established roads. Of course, every now and then, Vikings would adhere to traditional rules of warfare. For example, if a tribe of Vikings was confronted on land by an opponent of equal size and strength, they'd begin their battle by forming a shield wall. It worked like this. Before one spear was thrown, warriors from each tribe would face off with each other in a wedge-like formation. This was a shield wall. Depending on the size of the army, a shield could be made up of 5 to 6 rows of warriors holding round, handheld wooden shields. The bulk of the wedge formation was usually made up of heavily armed men with berserkers at the very front of the wedge. Yes, berserkers. More on that in a minute. Archers and the other veterans of the tribe would then line up behind the wedge, and bodyguards called herds would surround their leaders and chiefs at the back. The ground battle would finally begin when a warrior threw a spear over their enemy's lines. Waves of spears followed, with armor-piercing arrows fired off by archers close behind. Often, the opening salvo determined the fight. Eventually, one of the tribes would stagger and reel away from the spears and arrows that rained down upon them. Of course, if both tribes remained standing after the initial downpour of spears, the warriors of each side pushed forward to wage close-quarter hand-to-hand combat with their enemies. Okay, berserkers. They deserve some special acknowledgement. We all know that Vikings were insane warriors, but they were nothing compared to berserkers, a special group of elite Vikings who were so badass they didn't even wear armor or helmets. They fought in loincloths, and the only weapon they used was a light shield. Berserkers were skilled warriors for sure, but the thing that made them so dangerous was that they had no fear. Before battle, they would work themselves up into a crazed, trance-like state called berserkgang, and then fight with blind fury. While in this frenzied state during raids, berserkers lost all human capacity for reason or awareness and were known to scream and howl like wolves or mad dogs. You now know where Wolverine's berserker mode was inspired from. If you believe the lore, these berserkers were said to have spiritual magical powers from the god of war, Odin. It's also hypothesized that berserkers would prep for battle by drinking gallons of alcohol and consuming magic mushrooms, although most people on this concoction would just start playing guitar by a campfire. Some botanists have claimed that berserker behavior could have been caused by eating a plant called bog myrtle, one of the main spices in Scandinavian beer. In land raids, tribes would position their berserkers at the front of the wedge. The boar's snout would then rush their enemies' battle lines and take their formation apart in hand-to-hand combat. At this point, the raid would turn into a straight-up Donnybrook, and the tribe that won usually had the strongest assembly of berserkers. Vikings loved their weapons as much as a dog loves going for a ride. A typical raid saw Vikings use axes, swords, bows, and arrows, and daggers, but their go-to weapon of choice was the spear. Inexpensive and easy to make, spears also had reach, which was pretty helpful when a raid devolved into hand-to-hand combat. With a tip made of iron measuring anywhere from 8 to 24 inches and the wooden shaft usually made of straight-grain ash, a Viking spear was used mostly for throwing, but an adept warrior could use theirs for carving, chiseling, and chopping as well. It's like the Viking version of a Swiss Army knife. There's little evidence that tells us the length of a shaft from the Viking Age, but Chapter 6 of Gila's saga tells of a spear so long a man's outstretched arm could barely touch the rivet. Of course, most historians estimate that the combined length of a wooden shaft and iron head of a Viking-era spear was between 7 and 10 feet long. Swords were pretty rare in the Viking Age. They were expensive, difficult to make, and very few Vikings owned a good one. That meant that swords were the mark of an elite warrior and treated as heirlooms passed down from bearded father to son for generations. You could determine the quality of a sword by the elaborately decorated hilts or by the bladesmith's name that was imprinted near the base of the blade, just like a brand name imprinted on anything you buy today. Different styles with varying looks were even given nicknames by Vikings, like Legbiter and Gold Hilt. Not sure if Heart Eater or Oathkeeper ever made it to real life. Most Vikings preferred double-edged swords, ranging in length from 24 to 36 inches long and 1.5 to 2.5 inches in width. For older Vikings, a 40-inch sword wasn't uncommon, and they were relatively light. They weighed anywhere between 2 to 4 pounds, depending on length. Of course, Hollywood likes to portray Vikings slashing their victims while holding their swords with a two-fisted stranglehold, but that's not how it went down. If you look at the grip of a sword from the Viking Age, you'll see that it was made for one hand. There was no need for an extended grip on a Viking sword because it would throw off the weight of the weapon, plus their other hand was busy holding a shield anyway. While these swords were usually passed from father to son as heirlooms, there is evidence that some Vikings were buried with them. In these cases, the Viking sword was ritualistically killed, which means its blade was bent so that it was unusable. This served two purposes. It acted as a way to retire the sword with its owner, and it deterred grave robbers from stealing the weapon. When it came to a Viking raid, a warrior had two means of defense, his cunning and his shield. Even though they were made of wood, usually fir, alder, spruce, or poplar, like Mickey Ward, a Viking shield could take quite a beating in battle. A few shields have survived from the Viking Age, and they vary in size from 32 to 36 inches in diameter. It was also noted that a shield was often custom-made for a warrior. It was sized to fit the dimensions of his body and his fighting style. A shield needed to be big enough to provide protection, but not too big that it threw off the balance of the warrior. Too small would expose additional lines of attack that an opponent could exploit. Too large would slow the defensive response and exhaust the warrior unnecessarily. There's been great debate about the role of shield maidens in Viking culture, namely whether these powerful women even existed in the first place. Scandinavian folklore and mythology have always been there with tales of bravery and cunning battle prowess. But archaeologists from Uppsala University and Stockholm University have found new DNA evidence that shows female warriors have roots in actual historical events. Technology recently caught up with the excavation of one of the most well-known graves from the Viking Age, a mid-10th century grave in a Swedish Viking town named Birka. The tomb was excavated in the 1880s, revealing the remains of a female warrior surrounded by an axe, a bow and arrow, a sword, armor-piercing arrows, and 2 horses. But like we said, the folklore and mythology have always been there. According to the Greenland saga, when Leif Eriksson's pregnant half-sister, Freydis Erik's daughter, was in Vinland, it was written that she grabbed a sword and bare-breasted scared away the attacking Skraelings. In another instance, Viking leader Lagertha commanded a band of 120 ships of warriors. When her ex-husband Ragnar Lothbrok faced near certain defeat in a fight, Lagertha sailed to his rescue, launching a surprise attack on the enemy from behind, reportedly causing Ragnar's opponents to panic. Shield maidens also reportedly fought while disguised in men's clothes. Thus, they were sometimes indistinguishable from male warriors. Yep, shield maidens existed, and they were as badass as their male counterparts. A herd was made up of elite bodyguards with the sole purpose of protecting the Viking chief at the back of the wedge during battles. A wealthy and skilled chief might have as many as 60 herdmen protecting them on the battlefield. These herdmen were smart, always armed warriors, and they guaranteed their leaders' safety. In the Vikings' pecking order, you could think of them as the Navy SEALs. Of course, a herdman's job wasn't only reserved for battles and raids. Due to the fact that an influential Viking chief had enemies lurking everywhere, a herdman was on the clock 24/7. And while a herdman put his life on the line every day, he was rewarded greatly for his services and lived a privileged life that young Vikings envied. A member of a herd was as close to being a celebrity as a Viking could become without actually being royalty. You never knew what you were going to get in a Viking raid. Sometimes a tribe's attack was nothing more than a smash-and-grab affair with the sole intent of grabbing some loot and food and returning to their own village. In cases like these, a raiding party could consist of anywhere between 35 and 300 Vikings. But a full-scale battle was different. Full-scale battles meant entire Viking armies showed up against each other. Bigger Viking armies could contain between 4,000 and 7,000 men, and as the Viking Age wore on, the armies only grew in size. In the early 850s, attacks on the English cities of Canterbury and London reportedly involved 350 Viking ships. If we're to believe these figures, this Viking army may have been at least 10,000 strong. Oh man, imagine drinking your morning tea and seeing 10,000 Vikings heading your way. Gulp. You've seen the Minnesota Vikings helmet, the 1993 Nintendo classic The Lost Vikings, Hagar the Horrible comic strip, and the Bugs Bunny cartoon called What's Opera, Doc? With Elmer Fudd and his magic helmet. Despite all these iconic cultural influences, a real Viking helmet never had horns. In reality, a Viking helmet was a simple, practical piece of equipment. It was made of iron, and many historians believe that due to cost, only the elite warriors owned them. Most Vikings fought without headgear. In fact, there have only been 5 Viking helmets recovered, most of which are just fragments and deteriorated pieces of iron. The only full Viking helmet is called the Geirmenbu helmet, which now is on display at the Museum of Cultural History of the University of Oslo. So how did the horned Viking helmet myth begin? You can pin that on costume designer Carl Emil Doppler. When composer Richard Wagner staged his Der Rings der Nibelungen opera cycle in the 1870s, he turned to Doppler for the production's costumes. Doppler created horned helmets for the Viking characters, and a Nordic stereotype was born. While Vikings owned horses, you'd rarely see one at a raid or battle. The problem with horses was that they were difficult to transport in ships when Vikings sailed off for a raid. Strangely enough, a good number of horses that were acquired by Vikings were taken either by looting them or by stealing them from their defeated enemies, as we know from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Most Viking horses were used for farming purposes. The Vikings are even thought to have introduced plowing with horses to the British Isles. The Vikings adopted horses for plowing because they were quicker and more agile than the more commonly used oxen. It's theorized that the Vikings could plow and plant their fields quickly with their horses and then go off raiding for the summer before returning home in time for harvest. There is record of at least one battle where Vikings used horses, but the results weren't so great. During the Battle of Sulcoit in Ireland in 968, the Vikings of Limerick, led by Ivar of Limerick, deployed a cavalry of warriors on horseback. These Vikings were lured into an ambush by the Irish and lost both the battle and the town of Limerick. Even though Viking raids were bloody and brutal, warriors still found the opportunity to swipe right. Proof of this happened in the 9th century when Ragnar Lothbrok led an attack to avenge the death of his grandfather at the hand of a rival king. According to passages in the 9th book of the Gesta Danorum, a 12th century work of Danish history by the Christian historian Saxo Grammaticus, King Fro killed Ragnar's grandfather Seward and forced the dead king's surviving female family members into a brothel as a form of public humiliation. When he heard about this, Ragnar came with an army of warriors to avenge his grandfather. Many of the women Fro had ordered into the brothel dressed themselves into men's clothes and fought on Ragnar's side. One of those women was Lagerta, a shield maiden whose fierce fighting had attracted Ragnar's attention. After the battle, Ragnar pursued Lagerta and proposed to her. Lagerta feigned interest, and Ragnar arrived to seek her hand. However, Lagerta released a bear and a hound to attack Ragnar, which, according to Saxo, he had to kill before he could marry her. Who said romance was dead? Ragnar killed the bear with a spear and choked the hound to death, thus winning the hand of Lagerta. The couple had a son, Fridleif, as well as 2 daughters, but eventually Ragnar divorced Lagerta because he apparently still harbored bitterness about the whole bear and hound attack. Totally understandable, right? During the era of the Vikings, Scandinavians were, in general, highly concerned with their appearance, particularly their hair. According to records in a chronicle attributed to a 13th century English monk called John of Wallingford, the Vikings would comb their hair every day, bathe every Saturday, and change clothes frequently. According to John, the purpose of these customs, which he saw as frivolous whims, was to draw attention to oneself. Viking men liked to wear their hair long in the front with short or shaved locks in the back, what many today might call a reverse mullet. The long sections may have been worn pulled back, something women of the time also might have done with their long hair. The extent to which Vikings modified their teeth is a matter of some debate among historians, but there is evidence to that effect. Archaeologists discovered filed teeth among the remains at Scandinavian burial sites in 2005 and in England in 2009. The teeth were intentionally filed with grooves that may have indicated victories against opponents. Another theory proposes that the filings were meant to intimidate their enemies. Equally mysterious is what exactly the Vikings used to do the filing. While archaeologists still have no hard and firm answers, the evidence suggests the work was done by a skilled practitioner. If there's one thing archaeological evidence makes clear about the Vikings, it's that they knew the value of a good comb. Viking burial sites reveal individuals who were buried with military tools, as well as combs and other personal items. These combs were typically made of bone, antler, or metal, as were their tweezers, razors, and ear picks. Items used for grooming were usually ornately decorated, and as evidenced by the holes drilled into them, were probably worn on a chain that was either attached to the belt or hung around the neck. Sometimes they were even worn as brooches. Vikings at times also carried combs in boxes, attesting to the tool's importance. Vikings, the original bearded hipsters. Most, if not all, Viking men had facial hair, and their culture dictated that they keep that hair neat and tidy. Grooming tools like razors, combs, and tweezers were just as likely to be used on beards and mustaches as they were on the hair atop a Viking's head. Of course, there were other considerations. The length of one's beard was considered an indicator of maturity and even masculinity. A lack of facial hair could open one up to being mocked. In the 13th century Icelandic work, Njál's Saga, the title character, Njál, is described as wealthy in goods and handsome of face, although no beard grew on his chin. His lack of facial hair receives continued mention, even earning him the moniker Beardless Karla, while his sons are called Dung Beardlings. Due to his lack of facial hair, Njál's competence and manliness are constantly called into question. The text even implies that his sons, or at least their hair, were derived from dung rather than their father's fertility. Viking baths and saunas were visited for both cleanliness and enjoyment. Washing in a local stream during the summer months could provide much-needed relief from the heat, while bathhouses and saunas offered warmth and a chance to sweat during the winter. Bathhouses and saunas also served as meeting places and were thought to have medicinal value. A cold bath could ease aches and pains, while steam was believed to revitalize the spirit. Bathhouses and saunas could be constructed near natural hot springs or by using water heated in large vats. According to the sagas, Some Vikings even had advanced piping systems to move hot and cold water to their baths. Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic writer who recorded much of what we know about Norse paganism today, is believed to have built an elaborate bath at his farmhouse in Reykholt. Though it may come as a surprise to many, there is evidence that some Norse communities had latrines near their longhouses. The Viking sagas mention latrines that were set some distance away from well-traversed and populated living spaces. These latrines were communal, but there are some suggestions that group facilities may also have been built inside longhouses. For example, one kamar, or privy, discovered at Stoink included trenches that carried waste away from the longhouse to an outdoor location. Archaeologists also found an outdoor latrine at a former Viking settlement in Denmark. After analyzing the contents of the 1,000-year-old latrine, researchers discovered it contained parasites carried by both humans and animals. These included roundworm, human whipworm, and liver fluke, the latter of which most commonly affects cattle and sheep. The latrine also contained evidence that suggested the worm infestations from the Viking Age contributed to a genetic anomaly that affects modern descendants of Vikings. Their genes adapted to counteract intestinal parasites and prevent potential diseases, creating a mutation that may now, unfortunately, lead to lung cancer. Viking families lived in longhouses, which were structures made out of wood with roofs made out of turf or straw. Benches that could be used for sleeping or sitting were typically built along the walls. Warmth, light, and a place to cook was provided by a fire that was usually set in the middle of the house. But since they had no windows, this meant the longhouses were typically smoky. The dirt floors also contributed to a generally dusty, ash-laden environment. The longhouses would generally be shared by extended families, which meant that privacy wasn't really a thing. During the cold months, the animals would take refuge in the longhouses right along with the people. This further crowded the situation and probably didn't help with the smell. According to Graugaus, or the laws of early Iceland, humiliating a fellow Viking was considered an extremely serious offense. How serious? Well, the law actually stated that if a man cuts hair from someone's head or makes him dirty anywhere in order to disgrace him or tears or cuts clothing off him, the penalty in every case is outlawry. To declare a person an outlaw, the injured party had to bring witnesses to a meeting of the Althing, the assembly that served as something of a judicial authority for Vikings. Only the Althing could pronounce a sentence of outlawry, but the individual, the involved families, and society as a whole were then responsible for enforcing that punishment. Full outlawry, the type of outlawry that sometimes resulted from causing humiliation, was a lifetime sentence that removed an individual from any and all legal and social protections. So to sum it up, Vikings took cleanliness so seriously you could lose all of your rights and legal protections for getting one of them dirty. Alongside their great concern for cleanliness and grooming, historical sources suggest that Vikings were equally concerned with the state of their clothing and overall presentation of self. Both Viking men and Viking women wore clothes made out of wool and linen, which would be washed in nearby lakes and streams. According to the Havamal, an Old Norse poem preserved in a 13th century work called the Codex Regius, though he may not be very well dressed, of his shoes and breeches no man should be ashamed. While John of Wallingford indicated that Vikings bathed only on Saturdays, writings from the Viking Age itself indicate that men cleaned themselves, at least to some extent, every morning. No one knows for sure, but daily washing is believed to have most likely included cleaning one's face and hands. According to the poem Hreesmal, which is also found in the Codex Regius, men needed to comb their hair and wash themselves every day, for unknown it is where that eve he may be. Similarly, Havamal is also known as the Words of Odin the High One, states that men should be fed and washed when venturing out for the day. Despite all this, Viking hygiene habits still left a few things to be desired. According to the 10th century Arab Muslim diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, Vikings, particularly a group known as the Rus, do not clean themselves after excreting or urinating, or wash themselves when in a state of ritual impurity. And just to be clear, that last part meant they didn't bathe after having sex. So naughty. Vikings did not use forks. Rather, they ate with spoons, knives, and sometimes their fingers. The knives they used for eating also tended to be used for grooming, hunting, fighting, and just about whatever else they might need a knife for. Spoons were usually made from wood, as were the bowls they ate from. Like grooming utensils, Vikings kept their spoons and knives close, often being worn around the neck on a chain or attached to their belts. According to the aforementioned Ibn Fadlan, who observed the group of Vikings known as the Rus in the 10th century, every day without fail, the Vikings would wash their faces and their heads with the dirtiest and filthiest water there could be. He then described how every morning a young serving girl would come with breakfast and a great basin of water. She would proffer it to her Viking master, who would then wash his hands and face in it, as well as his hair. That doesn't sound so bad, but Ibn Fadlan also said that after the Viking would wash and disentangle his hair in the basin, he would then blow his nose and spit and do every filthy thing imaginable in the water. Which is kind of gross, but not that horrible. Hang on. After that, the servant would carry the bowl to the man next to him. Okay, that's pretty gross, but it goes on. Then he says, she goes on, passing the basin round from one to another until she has taken it to all the men in the house in turn. And each of them blows his nose and spits and washes his face and hair in this basin. That is super disgusting. But there's some debate over how much truth there is to what Ibn Fadlan said he saw. He was an Islamic diplomat, and Viking practices were anathema to his own sensibilities and beliefs about cleanliness. So there's a good chance he may have exaggerated, at least a little bit. On the other hand, they might have just been that gross. Oh, you Vikings. Now, before we get to the dietary stuff, there's a little matter of etymology we'd like to address. Whenever we discuss Vikings, there's always a number of people who appear in the comments to state their belief that the word Viking is a verb that refers to an activity and not a noun that describes a type of person. Yeah, it's true the Old Norse language included the verb Viking, which was an activity. It also included the noun Vikingur. A Vikingur was a person who went on expeditions that typically took them by sea to foreign lands. The term was a neutral one, which didn't imply any particular ethnicity, and which one might use to describe their own group as easily as a group that they were not part of. A Vikingur usually traveled in such groups, and the plural form of the Old Norse word was vikingar. The English word Viking is derived from this noun. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, many modern folks are used to having 3 meals a day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But things were a little different for the Vikings. They structured their daily life around 2 meals, which a family would typically gather to eat out of wooden bowls at a communal table. The Vikings ate their first meal, which was called the dagmal, or day meal, about an hour after waking up. The dagmal usually consisted of the previous night's leftover scouse, with fruit and stale bread on the side. Basically, the Viking equivalent of waking up to cold pizza left over from the night before. Children might eat porridge made from buckwheat, oats, and millet, with fruit mixed in. The evening meal, or nattmal, took place after the day's work was complete. Evening meals were typically far more substantial, consisting of more meat and stew. The Vikings' preferred method of cooking meat was to boil it. The meat could come from a number of sources. Hunters often caught reindeer, elk, or even bear. And farmers raised horses, cows, and pigs for consumption. Viking cooks usually boiled the protein in a cauldron over a fire. For unusually large feasts, they would dig pits in the ground, line them with wood, then fill the holes with water and hot stones to get a simmer going. That boiled meat would form the base of a stew called scouse. Scouse was the backbone of the Viking diet, since it was always cooking in a Viking kitchen. Once the boiled meat was removed from the cauldron or pit, the liquid would be left behind to cook more vegetables and meat, generating more flavors over days and weeks. When left sitting overnight, a layer of fat would rise to the top of the scouse, which both preserved this stew and made it relatively healthier. Boiling wasn't the only method of cooking Vikings had at their disposal. We know that sometimes they would also cook meat on a spit, but it wasn't nearly as common. Digging around the remnants of an ancient outhouse doesn't sound like a lot of fun, But archaeologists have gathered a wealth of information from doing exactly that. Viking toilets and trash heaps reveal the truth about what they ate, and it wasn't just food. Research has revealed that Vikings were prone to parasites in their intestines, likely from undercooked meat. Vikings took great care to preserve meats and other foods for longevity, but that may not have been enough to keep them from getting worms. Studies also show that Vikings ate poisonous plants, either as a vegetable or ground up into the flour used to make their bread. That's pretty badass. You know what this bread could use? A touch more poison. Given that Vikings spent so much time on the sea, it's probably not too surprising to anyone that fish were one of the fundamental staples of their diet. Vikings are known to have fished rivers, lakes, streams, and oceans to dine on saltwater and freshwater fish alike. Like their meats, Vikings smoked, salted, and dried fish. They needed to be able to pack it for long voyages at sea, as well as to preserve it over long winter months. So the important thing was to keep it from rotting.
Am I the only one who feels queasy around here?
If you're wondering what specific fish were popular with the Norse, herring was ubiquitous on Viking plates. And they made a dried cod dish known as stockfish, which historians think may have been traded throughout Europe. Despite our image of the Vikings as a seagoing people, they actually spent a lot of their time on land and drew many elements of their diet from ordinary farm animals. Vikings had cows, sheep, and goats. That means if there's one thing they had a ton of, it was milk. Because it was difficult to keep foods from going bad, they often used that milk to produce fermented dairy products of some kind. They made butter, cheese, yogurt, and a specialty called skyr. Skyr, which translates to curds, is a soft, yogurt-like cheese that Vikings stored and kept over the winter when fresh milk was unavailable. To make skyr, Vikings heated up skimmed milk and left it out to curdle and develop cultures. Once curdled, they strained the curdled mixture through cloth, scraping the yogurt from the fabric. The thick whey that remained didn't go to waste. Vikings drank the liquid by itself, pickled vegetables with it, and used it to preserve meat. The Vikings also kept sour milk, which they would add to bread and other foods. Vikings ate scouse with multigrain bread, which was another daily staple in their diet. They made this bread from a mix of grains that included wheat, barley, oats, and rye, as well as with beans, honey, nuts, and ground tree bark that added a healthy touch to the loaves. Vikings typically made their bread in a skillet placed below the scouse cauldron in cooking fires. This type of bread would harden as it cooled, so the scouse stew was great for softening up old loaves. If you ever got scolded for not finishing your vegetables, you can take heart knowing that many Vikings probably got the same scolding. With gardens overflowing with onions, cabbage, beans, celery, carrots, and peas, the Vikings were no strangers to vegetables. They supplemented their crops by gathering wild greens and seaweed. The Viking diet had plenty of flavors, too, thanks to the use of spices like mustard, horseradish, and cumin. Vikings also relied heavily on foraged fruits, nuts, and seeds. Since the winters were so harsh, Vikings kept stores of dried berries, plums, and apples that allowed them to enjoy fruits year-round. Farmers also incorporated seeds, fruit, and nuts such as walnuts and hazelnuts into bread and ground them into oils. Land and sea animals were not the only protein sources for Vikings. Birds and eggs were also common ingredients in their meals. Based on excavations, the auk, a large bird that's now extinct, was essential to the local diet, and Viking farmers are known to have raised domesticated chickens to provide fresh eggs. We also know that Vikings sometimes put in a good deal of effort to secure the birds they needed for food. For example, they often scaled cliffs to track seabirds, and lowered themselves using ropes to gather eggs directly from nests.
Oddvar, maybe you want to go next.
The Vikings had to keep an eye on the seasons and plan for the year accordingly. But it paid off in the long run, because compared to the average medieval person, Vikings had one of the most balanced and nutritious diets. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings were pretty resourceful when it came to what they ate. While it's true geography influenced the types of ingredients that were available, the Vikings still brought their farming and hunting techniques with them as they made their way to new areas. Vikings grew vegetable gardens and even cultivated fruit orchards. They also hunted whatever was available, including elk, boar, deer, bear, and seal. Water could be dangerous to drink in Viking villages, so ale became a fixture alongside meals. Viking ale derived from malted barley and came in two forms, weak and strong. The weak beer was light enough for children to drink and served as a general companion to salty stockfish and dried meats. The stronger version was uncorked for festive occasions alongside batches of mead. Vikings made mead out of fermented honey, but that wasn't the only use for the syrup. Honey was also the only sweetener at the Vikings' disposal, and they got creative with it. They added honey to bread and served it with fresh and dried fruit as a dessert. Since Vikings typically had to make do with what was available, the types of meat they ate could vary. For example, while fish and other sea creatures were staples throughout the Viking world, in Greenland, Vikings ate a lot of seals, and they may have eaten walrus too. Vikings also raised horses as a common source of food before the spread of Christianity. That party ended in the year 732, when Pope Gregory III issued a papal edict banning the consumption of horse meat due to its connection to pagan rituals. Those rituals were meant to honor the Norse god Odin, so obviously they weren't particularly popular with the Pope. It's commonly said that there ain't no party like a Viking party, and if it's not commonly said, it probably should be. Because the Vikings took great care in preparing feasts for harvests, religious festivals, weddings, and other special occasions. They typically pulled out all the stops, providing a great variety of meats, cheeses, and other items available. Not surprisingly, this was especially true for wealthier families. For the winter celebration, Vikings allegedly sacrificed boars and spoke oaths before eating the game meat. According to Viking sagas, feasts and festivals were places for excessive alcohol consumption, where revelers passed the drinking horn around freely. Finally, you might not be surprised to learn that research suggests a Viking diet, one based heavily on fish, non-root vegetables, tea, water, and limited sugar and starches, may be good for your brain. A Viking diet could help prevent dementia, in addition to helping you lose weight. In a study conducted in Sweden, subjects who stuck to the Nordic prudent dietary pattern had higher cognitive function than individuals whose diets consisted of fatty and processed foods. So the next time you sit down to a meal, consider eating like a Viking. Leif Erikson was the son of Eric the Red, the first Norseman to colonize Greenland after being exiled from Iceland. Oh, Eric's son. Oh, I just got it. Leif ventured to Norway around the year 1000 CE, where he entered the service of King Olav Tryggvason, who charged him with spreading Christianity. On his way back to Greenland, Leif supposedly ventured off course and took a detour that landed him in Vinland, an area located somewhere in what is known today as Canada. This likely makes Leif the first European to ever set foot in the New World, and he did it almost 450 years before Christopher Columbus was born. The details of this trip, however, are a little muddled. The Vinland expeditions were recorded in two separate sagas, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, and each tells the story very differently, which leaves plenty of room for creative license. Music to a TV writer's ears. Eric the Red's daughter, Fredish, was born around 970. In both Eric's saga and the Saga of the Greenlanders, she is portrayed as a fierce woman, chastising retreating men for their cowardice and demanding a weapon of her own to join the fight. She was also brutally cunning. Fredish recruited two Vikings to sail to Vinland, offering to split the spoils of the trip with them, but she double-crossed them when they arrived, accusing them of assaulting her. Fredish's husband, Horvart, annihilated the men. Fredish then grabbed an axe and dispatched the 5 women who had also accompanied them on the voyage. Note to self, do not answer any of Fredish's Craigslist ads. As the King of Norway from 1046 to 1066, Harald Sigurdsson, aka Harald Hardrada, which means hard ruler or ruthless, spent his youth as a member of the Varangian Guard in the Byzantine Empire. After traversing the Mediterranean and living in modern-day Russia for a time, Harald returned home and became King of Norway in 1047, following the death of Magnus the Good. Magnus had also been King of Denmark, but the Danes refused to submit to Harald. Hard to follow a guy nicknamed the Good, particularly when you're Harald the Ruthless, which sounds like a pretty cool wrestling persona. Around 1064, Harald set his sights on England instead. invading the countryside along Tostig Goinsson, the brother of King Harald Goinsson, in September 1066. Asserting he had a claim through his relative Canute the Great, Harald saw King Goinsson as a usurper. After arriving in England, Harald Hardrada and Tostig defeated the Northumbrian earls and their men at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th, 1066. 5 days later, the Battle of Stamford Bridge pitted Harald against Harold, which had to have been confusing for everyone involved. But the confusion didn't last long because King Harald Goinsson won the battle, eliminating Harald the Ruthless and Tostig in the process. As one of the longest ruling kings of England, Athelred endured years of conflicts with Viking raids, and later inhabitants of England. It was under Athelred that England reinstated Danegeld payments to the Vikings, which was essentially tribute money paid to keep the Vikings from causing trouble, sort of like a geopolitical protection racket. However, they didn't actually do much to keep the Danes away. The presence of the Danes in England was so problematic for the king by 1002 that he called for what is known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. St. Brice's Day. Never really caught on, did it? Sounds more like the name of a tennis instructor doing time for a pyramid scheme. Athelred issued a charter that ordered the slaying of all Danish men in England. This only further antagonized the Danes. The raids continued, as did the Danegeld payments, and in 1013, Sven Forkbeard entered England and took Athelred's crown. When a guy named Sven Forkbeard comes to your hat, it's probably best just to give it to him. King of Denmark, Norway, and England through the early 11th century, Canute the Great did a whole lot of work for his nickname. He was the son of Sven Forkbeard, but after Sven's demise in 1014, England did not acknowledge Canute as its new ruler, opting to support Athelred the Unready instead. Athelred did eventually return to England, but he was unable to resist Canute's Scandinavian forces. Canute took control of England by 1018, married Athelred's widow, and established an empire of sorts in the North Sea region. Canute became the sole ruler of Denmark in 1019, and ruled Norway as of 1028. He was the undisputed holder of 3 world titles, like Mike Tyson in the 80s. Canute was a skilled warrior, but also a clever ruler. He mingled personnel from England and Denmark to control his lands, and issued a law code in 1020. He also established diplomatic relationships with the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. But Canute's death in 1035 created a power vacuum that pitted his sons against each other, which is kind of weird. It's not like he didn't have enough kingdoms to go around. Emma of Normandy was the daughter of a Norman duke, wife to 2 English kings, and mother of 2 more. Talk about versatility. Emma's first marriage to King Athelred the Unready resulted in the birth of 2 sons, Alfred and Edward, and the birth of a daughter named Gujivu. To keep her children safe during the Norsemen's strikes against England, Emma sent her children to Normandy to be raised. After Canute the Great smote King Athelred and took control of England in 1016, Emma wed Canute, and they had 2 children, a daughter, Gunhild, and a son, Harthacnut, who went on to rule England from 1040 to 1042. Records indicate Emma was fairly active in making sure her son became king, purportedly securing a promise from Canute that he would never set up the son of any wife other than herself to rule after him. This was intended to keep Harold Harefoot, Canute's son by his first wife, off the throne. All that pillaging created some complicated family dynamics, like a cutthroat Brady Bunch. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut actually ruled England jointly after Canute's passing in 1035. Kind of like a share the kingdom with your little brother or nobody gets McDonald's situation. Harold Harefoot ousted his brother from power in 1037, but passed in 1040, leaving Harthacnut as the only living heir. King Olaf II of Norway, also known as Olaf Haraldsson, was brother to Harald Hardrada. You remember the ruthless guy? Olaf ruled Norway from 1015 to 1030, systematically bringing Norway's chiefdoms under his control through the late 1010s. He lost the support of his nobles in 1029, however, and was sent into exile. Apparently didn't grease enough palms. If only Lakers tickets had been invented. He later returned to Norway, where he fought and perished at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Olaf was a devout Christian and sought to convert Norway, but his particular brand of evangelicalism was more death metal than tabernacle choir. Olaf reportedly drove many pagans out of the country. Other non-believers had their hands and feet mutilated and their eyes yanked out, or were simply hanged. Maybe Olaf should have been the ruthless. Olaf was praised for his efforts on behalf of Christianity and is now considered a saint. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, reached prominence in England during the reign of King Canute the Great. After Canute's demise, Godwin supported Harthacnut's claim to the Danish throne. At the same time, Alfred, the oldest son of our bumbling pal Athelred the Unready, attempted to invade England. Alfred apparently took a page from his father's playbook. He was intercepted by Godwin and turned over to Harold Harefoot, who blinded Alfred and had him executed. Godwin, on the other hand, was a shrewd figure. Between 1035 CE and 1042 CE, he shifted his loyalties to whomever held the crown. Not the worst strategy. He was like Littlefinger, only better written. By the time Edward the Confessor, Athelred's other son with Emma of Normandy, became king in 1042, Godwin yielded immense power in England. Godwin's daughter, Edith, married King Edward in 1045. King Edward briefly exiled Godwin and his sons, Sven, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwin, and Harold, but they eventually returned to control pretty much the entire country. After Godwin passed in 1053, his oldest son, Harold, inherited the earldom of Wessex. By 1062, Tostig became the Earl of Northumbria. Sven was the Earl of Herefordshire, Gurth held the earldom of East Anglia, and Leofwin was made Earl of Kent. And when Edward passed in 1066, Harold was crowned king. Godwin was so dedicated to the long game that he didn't even live to see his plans pay off. Edric Striona was the Earl of Mercia during the reign of Athelred the Unready, eventually marrying the king's daughter, Elgitha. Edric remained loyal to his father-in-law until 1015, when he switched his allegiance to Canute the Great. The bookie might give you great odds, but never bet on a guy called the Unready. Identified as a traitor by chroniclers like John of Worcester, Edric took up arms against Athelred's son, Edmund Ironside, when Edmund became king after his father's demise. Edmund only ruled from April to October of 1016, before he was booted off the throne by Canute after the disastrous Battle of Essendune. Meanwhile, things were looking pretty good for Edric. But in 1017, his ever-changing loyalty finally caught up with him when Canute the Great had him executed. It's not entirely clear which figure from Scandinavian history inspired Estrid Håkon. One possibility is Håkon Eriksson, also known as Håkon of Lata. Håkon of Lata was in Norway when Olaf Haraldsson returned to take the throne in 1015. Håkon later ruled Norway in Canute's stead during the 1020s, while Olaf Haraldsson was in exile. The second possible inspiration is Håkon Sigurdsson. He was also Earl of Lata, albeit during the mid-10th century. Håkon Sigurdsson was dedicated to the pagan Norse gods, something that brought him support from Norwegian chieftains while he ruled Norway. However, in 995 CE, Håkon was betrayed by his own slave, Kark, who drew a large knife from his belt and decapitated him. Betrayed is certainly one word for that. There might be a lesson there, maybe about not owning slaves. Despite his bodacious name, Edmund Ironside only ruled England for a few months in 1016. Edmund inherited the throne in April from his extremely dead father, Athelred the Unready, but he lost it to Canute the Great in October, after being defeated at the Battle of Essendune, and died just 1 month later, meaning Edmund was king for roughly one season of Major League Baseball. I don't know which is more boring. And much like his dad, Edmund's entire life was riddled with almost comically bad luck. Born around 988, Edmund's mother, Elfgevu of York, passed away when he was just a boy. He had numerous siblings, including 2 older brothers, named Athelstan and Egbert. Those would be tough names to have in high school. Both of his older brothers perished, leaving Edmund the doomed heir to their father's throne. Interestingly, Edmund's life loosely inspired an Elizabethan-era play called Edmund Ironside, A War Hath Made All Friends. Although the author of the play is unknown, at least some academics believe it may be a very early work by William Shakespeare. That tiny footnote might be the most notable thing to happen to Edmund Ironside. But hey, better than nothing. In modern times, people tend to marry for love, but for Vikings, it was a little different. Marriage wasn't just a union of the couple, but of entire families. It was a transaction that was known as bruudkaup, which means bride buying, and it involved lawyers. There's nothing more romantic than the amorous smell of a lawyer. These types of unions had long-lasting legal implications in Norse culture, affecting everything from property holdings to inheritance. Nothing could be left to chance, so intricate negotiations were carried out before the terms of a marriage were formally agreed upon. In a nutshell, once a man selected a bride-to-be, usually on the advice of his parents, he, along with his father, nearest relatives, and best friends, would go ask the maiden's parents for their consent. This deal would then be sealed by a handshake between the girl's guardian and the suitor or his representative. At that point, the groom's family, along with their legal delegates, who basically filled the role of modern lawyers, negotiated with the bride's family to fix the amount of the bride price and the dowry. The groom's family, legal counsel, and any important local figures to whom they had connections could then bring proposals to the bride's family, promising to support and assist them while agreeing upon mutually beneficial terms for the marriage. It wasn't until after the money stuff was done that the happy couple could set a date. Picking a date for a wedding is always a tricky thing, and it was no different in Viking times. In fact, setting the date for a Viking wedding was a whole process. Traditionally, weddings were held on Friday, which in Norse religion is a sacred day for Frigg, the goddess of marriage. Friday, which means Day of Frigg, is actually named after this very goddess. Weddings typically lasted a week, and family and friends usually had to travel all the way from the land of ice and snow, from the midnight sun where the hot springs flow, to the site of the wedding. This meant that winter weddings were pretty much impossible because snow made travel extremely difficult. It also meant that the wedding party had to provide appropriate accommodations and enough food and drink for all the guests for the duration of the ceremony. Other considerations included the brewing of a special ale to be drunk by the bride and groom as part of the ceremony. It was a lot to think about, and pulling it all off sometimes meant a very long timetable for a wedding. While most ceremonies took place within a year from when all the negotiations were settled, 3-year waiting periods were not uncommon for Vikings in Iceland, whose frequent trips to Norway made it difficult to pin down an ideal date for everyone involved. In the lead up to the wedding, Norse brides and grooms were separated so they could symbolically strip away their former selves before entering their new lives together. What does that mean? Well, for the bride, it meant getting rid of old clothing and any symbols of her unwed status, such as her kransen, which is a gilt circlet worn by Scandinavian girls. The kransen, symbolic of the virginity the bride would also presumably be shedding, was then stored for the bride's future daughter. 2 points for recycling. Then, during the wedding ceremony, the kransen was replaced with a bridal crown. During her sequestration, the bride would cleanse herself in a bathhouse. But this wasn't just a relaxing day in the tub. There was a standard bathing practice. Hot stones were placed in the bath to produce steam, and then women often then switched themselves with birch twigs to induce perspiration, which symbolically washed away a bride's maiden status. So watch out for those birch twigs, ladies. Once the bath was finished, the bride plunged into cold water to close the pores and end the cleansing process. Throughout these preparations, women were attended by their mother, married sisters, and other married female relatives and friends. So much for privacy. Like Viking brides, grooms also may have undergone symbolic rituals before entering their new lives as married men. His attendants would be his father, married brothers, and other married males. And in order to rid themselves of bachelorhood and destroy all vestiges of the unmarried self, Viking men participated in a symbolic sword ceremony. You knew swords or axes were going to be involved one way or another. The ceremony started with a little casual grave robbing. According to many of the Norse sagas, and some historians believe archaeological data verifies it, a groom-to-be would break into a grave in order to retrieve the family sword of an ancestor. Through this action, he entered death as a boy and emerged into life as a man reborn. Once the groom had his sword, he, like his bride, went to a bathhouse to symbolically wash away his bachelor status and purify himself for the wedding ceremony. During his cleansing, he'd gain insight and instruction on husbandly and fatherly duties from his attendants. Archaeologists have been so far unable to determine if rubber duckies were involved. The final act of pre-wedding preparation for a Viking bride was dressing for the ceremony. Unlike modern brides, Viking ladies didn't wear elaborate costumes or gowns. Rather, the ornamental focus was on her hair and crown. A woman's hair was very important in Viking culture and indicative of her sexual allure. The longer, the better. so you probably didn't see a lot of pixie cuts. As a replacement for the conson, brides wore a bridal crown, which was typically a family heirloom. These crowns were usually made of silver adorned with crystals and elaborate designs like crosses and clover leaves, and draped with red and green garland silk cords. As for the groom, after completing the bathing ritual, he dressed for the wedding. Like the bride, a Viking groom had no particular costume or ornate garment he was required to wear. He did, however, bring his newly acquired sword to the ceremony, and may have also carried a symbol of Thor, such as a hammer, an axe, or, unless Marvel's Endgame has led us astray, a PlayStation 4. Showing up with such a weapon was symbolic of the groom's mastery in the union, and was believed to ensure a fruitful marriage. Once the premarital rituals were finished, the ceremony began. First came the exchange of the dowry and the bride price before witnesses. Once everyone had their respective financial gifts, they would begin the religious part of the ceremony. This meant summoning the attention of the gods and goddesses, a process that may have involved a sacrifice and incantation. If a sacrifice was necessary, Vikings used animals associated with gods of fertility. For Thor, a goat. For Freyja, a sow. For Frey, a boar or horse. The animal's blood was collected in a bowl and placed on an altar. A bundle of fir twigs was then dipped in the blood and used to sprinkle the couple, conferring the blessings of the gods, and presumably creating a lot of work for the couple's dry cleaner. In some cases, sacred animals were dedicated as living gifts. We imagine the animals were way more into that version rather than the whole blood sacrifice thing. In modern wedding ceremonies, the bride and groom exchange rings as a symbol of their vows. And while Vikings did exchange rings, they also exchanged something far more badass. Yeah, you guessed it. Swords. During a Viking wedding, the groom would present an ancestral sword to his bride, which she would then keep for any future sons they may have. The bride, in turn, then gifted the groom with a sword of her ancestors, symbolizing a transfer of the father's protection of the bride to the husband. This gift exchange also symbolized sacred union, sanctified by mystic rites. Once the awesome part with the swords was over, the bride and groom then exchanged rings to further consecrate their wedding vows. But they even did this part cooler than we do. How? By offering rings to one another on the hilt of their new swords. Attempts to reconstruct details of the Viking wedding ceremony have proven difficult for researchers. The information given in the sagas places a heavy emphasis on the legal bindings, rituals, and practicalities, but the details of the wedding feast itself were not as thoroughly documented. Nobody is exactly sure why this is, but it may be due to Christianity replacing pagan practices around the time Viking sagas were first written. What we do know is that the bridal and groom parties moved from the ceremony to the feast in a ritual called brudhlaup, which means bride running, or alternately, brudgómareið, which means the bridegroom's ride. It sounds pretty mysterious, but in Christian days, this simply consisted of the two parties walking separately from the site of the ceremony to the site of the feast. In pagan days, parties raced to the feast, and whichever party lost the race served beer to the winners for the night. In Christian Scandinavia, the groom arrived at the location of the feast and blocked the door to prevent the bride from entering without his assistance. Once she arrived, the groom helped her cross the threshold without tripping, hopefully. In this way, the bride completed her symbolic journey from maidenhood to marriage with the assistance of her husband. Once in the feast hall, the groom buried his sword in the ceiling, which we assume was amazeballs to watch, and the depth to which the sword sunk was believed to symbolize the enduring nature of the union. Earning the blessings of the gods was an important step on the path to becoming a parent and continuing the Viking bloodline. For example, at the feast, a representation of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, was placed in the bride's lap as she asked for Thor's blessing. If you're thinking that the symbolism of placing a hammer between the bride's leg is a little risque, well, you nailed it. The hammer was considered a symbol of Thor's manhood, and laying it on a new bride's womb and genitals was highly symbolic of exactly what you probably thought it was. Elsewhere in the Norse canon, the goddess Vor was said to witness a couple's vows and perhaps watch over the feast. Frey and Frigg were also often called upon in matters of love and marriage. It was a legal requirement for the bride and groom to drink bride ale together at their post-wedding feast. We assume some Viking microbrewery lobbied for that law. But it was very important for the couple, as their union was only binding once they drank together. The ale, for the record, was usually a honey-based mead, and the wedding could only go forward if the couple had enough of it to last a month, because it had to be drunk throughout their honeymoon. The first serving was presented to the groom by his wife in a vessel like the Swedish kosa, known as a loving cup. The bride might recite a formal verse while presenting the ale. Before drinking it, the groom consecrated the ale to Thor by making the sign of a hammer over it and making a toast to Odin. He then sipped and passed the cup to his bride, who made a toast to Freyja before drinking. The final wedding night ritual entailed escorting the newlyweds to the bridal couch. At least 6 witnesses led the couple by torchlight to their bed, where they consummated their marriage in full view of the witnesses. This ritual existed so there would be no doubt as to the consecration and validity of the marriage, and enough witnesses to settle any legal disputes that might arise. This is one Viking tradition we're pretty sure all modern married couples are happy to see consigned to the days of yore. Despite what pop culture tells us, whether or not Vikings had tattoos isn't entirely clear. Which seems weird, right? If there ever was a prime candidate for tattoos, it's a swole bearded raider with an axe. But I guess that also describes every heavy metal guitarist. In fact, there's only one single historical account that even mentions tattooed Vikings. It was written by the Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who lived from 879 to 960 CE. When he encountered the Rus, Scandinavians in Eastern Europe and Russia, he noted that from the tips of his toes to his neck, each man is tattooed in dark green with designs and so forth. In other words, they look like a bunch of Green Bay Packer fans. Despite the general lack of evidence, however, it is believed that Vikings probably did wear tattoos. These tattoos likely included runic characters of the younger Futhark system, which were prominent during the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, and had their origins in the aptly named Elder Futhark. Their meanings can be derived from various magical and mythological manuals assembled between the 12th and 17th centuries that contained folklore tales, spells, runic symbols, and staves. The Kaldrobok, for example, provides information about old Icelandic magic and is where we can find the closest thing to what a Viking tattoo may have actually looked like. Although, full disclosure, the magic spells do not appear to work. Believe us, we've tried. The term Valknut is a modern creation that means not of those fallen in battle, but the symbol itself, 3 triangles locked together, is ancient. Commonly found on rune stones and grave goods, the Valknut is considered a symbol of death, like a skull and crossbones, but with more flair. It is often carved and drawn near images of horses and wolves, which are associated with the Norse god Odin. The Vegvisir stave appears in the Huld manuscript of the Koldebrok, accompanied by one line of text which reads, "If this sign is carried, one will never lose one's way in storms or bad weather, even if the way is not known." So basically the magical equivalent of a GPS. The word Vegvisir combines 2 Icelandic terms, vegur and visir. The former means path, while the latter means guide. To be perfectly honest, whether or not Vegvisir was used during the Viking Age isn't clear, but the stave has come to symbolize protection. Elgich is associated with yew trees, but also represents elks, protection, and spirituality. But the coolest thing about this rune is that it's connected to the Valkyria, also known as the Valkyries. Valkyries were warrior women who rode horses, wolves, or boars. Really? Boars? And were responsible for deciding the fate of warriors in battle. They were responsible for carrying some of those warriors off to Freyja's afterlife, Folkvang, and others to Odin's afterlife, Valhalla. These mythical figures wore swan feathers, which lends Elgich to a connection with swans as well. Okay, if you've been to see a movie in the past 10 years, you probably know what this one is. Mjolnir, or Thor's hammer, is the magical weapon that can only be wielded by those who are worthy, at least according to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The power of the hammer makes it a tool of destruction, as well as an instrument of blessing, strength, protection, and power, and it appears in numerous Scandinavian sources. In the Prose Edda, for example, it's referenced numerous times, including in the poem Himishkveta, which calls Mjolnir the lover of murder. That's a hell of a nickname for a big hammer. The Helm of Awe, which sounds like a particularly impressive beer helmet, holds significant spiritual meaning and power in Norse mythology. 9 versions of it exist, with the Helm of Tyr as the most recognizable. Each of the helms serves specific symbolic purposes. One Helm of Awe type, for example, is used to get the affection of a woman. To make it work, the user must draw it on their palm with saliva when meeting the woman in question. Kinda sounds like one of those things you need to be a Viking in order to pull off. Other names for Inguch include Ing, Ingwach, and Ingwe, but regardless of spelling, it's linked to the earth and god Ing, who is later called Freyr. The rune corresponds to apple trees, selfheal, which is an edible purple-flowered herb, and the color yellow. In Norse mythology, Ing represented energy, fertility, and peace. His namesake rune similarly indicates these positive attributes, and is sometimes drawn with 4 diagonal lines extending off its 4 points. Wreath is linked to oak trees, the herb mugwort, and the color bright red. The rune corresponds to transportation and journeys using a wagon, a chariot, or simply a wheel. Who knows, maybe it also stands for rideshare. Phonetically, it sounds like an R. In terms of deities, the rune is connected to Forseti, the Norse god of justice and law. That being said, Wreath just looks like a big R, so you might not want to get it as a tattoo unless you are prepared to put up with a lot of people asking you why you're such a big fan of Reebok. The rune Soilo means sun, or, put another way, a solar wheel. Also called soul, and Soulo, it symbolizes wholeness and victory. Soilo is associated with junipers, mistletoe, the Norse sun goddess Sol, and the colors white and silver. In Old English, the rune is called sigil. It looks similar to an S and is likely to make people think you're really into Superman. The rune Ivach means yew tree. As a result, items that derive from yews like bows and arrows are connected to this rune. Ivach has great power in Norse mythology. It symbolizes transition, especially the transition between life and death. Regeneration, longevity, and even immortality also find representation in this rune. Now, about that immortality, is it for the tattoo or the person that wears the tattoo? Gebo, present in the elder Futhark, but not the younger Futhark, is represented with a simple X, so it would be real hard for your tattoo artist to mess this one up. It symbolizes gifts and generosity. As the crossing of 2 lines, Gebo represents 2 connecting and exchanging forces. It is linked to Odin and Freyja, and is associated with ash and elm trees, wild pansies, and the color dark blue. Bjarken is also called Bjork, so you might not want to get this one unless you're big into Dancer in the Dark. This rune corresponds to birch trees, lady's mantle, which is a type of perennial, and the color dark green. The direct connection to nature is found in its symbolic use to indicate the Earth Mother in both positive and negative ways. Birth, death, rebirth, and healing all find meaning with Bjarken, which is basically just a big letter B. The Norse god Tyr is a deity of justice, order, and war. And you know he's a big deal because he literally has a day of the week named in his honor, Tuesday, historically the most orderly and just spot on the calendar. The rune named after him, Tiwach, is similarly associated with these concepts and indicate forces that regulate life, the universe, and everything. Okay, not everything, but it does indicate balance, sacrifice, honor, and higher rationality. Tiwach has associations with oak trees, sage, and the color bright red, and it basically looks like an arrow pointing up. Dagach, or Dagar, is a rune that appears in the Elder Futhark meaning day. In particular, it refers to the light between night and day, dawn and twilight. So in a way, it is the rune of vampire melodrama. Dagach not only symbolizes light, but also balance, polarity, and enlightenment. The rune corresponds to spruce trees, the herb clary sage, the god and goddess Odin and Ostara, and the color light blue, so it's nothing if not versatile. Manach means man or human, but in the larger collective sense of all mankind, not just the mans down the street. The rune symbolizes the self as well as the divine ancestor of all humanity and the link between the heavens and earth. It corresponds to holly and matters being perennial climbing plants, and the color deep red, as well as the gods Odin and Heimdallr. This rune isn't found in the Younger Futhark, but when used in the Elder Futhark and Old English, it means horse. While it looks like the letter M, it has the phonetic value A, which admittedly is a little confusing. This rune symbolizes movement, trust, loyalty, and partnership, which appropriately are all components of the relationship between a rider and their faithful steed. You guys, it's all about communication. Othala represents property, homeland, and one's inborn nature in the Elder Futhark. Not present in the Younger Futhark, its name is Ethel in Old English, with a similar meaning. Because there's a sense of hereditary and ancestral property attached to this rune, it symbolizes personal qualities, clan descent, inheritance, and legacy. This is perhaps why it's linked to the gods Odin and Thor. Othala is also connected to hawthorn trees, the medicinal white flowering plant gold thread, the color deep yellow, and kind of looks like a rudimentary drawing of a fish standing on its fins, which would also be a pretty boss tattoo. Peorth appears only in the Elder Futhark and is often misrepresented as meaning fate. It's a little more complicated than that. Rather than simply meaning fate, Peorth is also associated with luck, which everyone could use a little of, as well as with cups and vessels used to cast lots. Basically, it's the rune of fate and Yahtzee. Rather than predestination or predeterminism, this rune is better interpreted as the relationship between cause and effect. Peorth also corresponds to beech trees, aconites, which are attractive, often toxic flowering plants, and the color black. Lakar looks like a backward number 1 and means lake or water. It symbolizes life, energy, growth, collective memory, and psychic powers, and also water. Phonetically, Lakar is akin to the letter L. It also corresponds to willow trees, leeks, and the color dark green. As a rune associated with the leeks, it's also used as a reference to fertility and phallic power, which explains its prevalence on Big Jorgensen t-shirts. Win is present in the Elder Futhark, but not the Younger Futhark. Symbolically, Win represents joy, the emotion, not the dish soap. And while the rune is shaped like a P, it's pronounced with a W sound. The rune is linked to ash trees and the flowering grain flax. In terms of color, yellow is tied to this rune, and both the god Freyr and elves are associated with it. Ish sounds like the letter I and means ice, which makes sense as it looks a little bit like an icicle. It represents movement of matter and energy along a vertical axis. Also, as a benefit of essentially being nothing more than a straight line, it is possibly the easiest tattoo to draw in the history of body art. Because ice was a fundamental part of Norse life, Ish can take on a small or large-scale significance. Ice can be underestimated and dangerous, but it also serves to give the soil a quiet rest during winter and insulate the fertile ground for the coming of spring. There you have it. We've given you the necessary tools to dazzle your tattoo artist with trivia the next time you go in to get some ink done. Just make sure you tip them in dollars. Runestones don't spend the same as they used to. To clarify, the term Viking refers to various groups of seafaring people from present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, who lived between the late 8th and 11th centuries, which is sometimes known as the Viking Age. You know, because of all the Vikings. Because they were such skilled sailors and navigators, piloting powerful naval weapons known as longships, their voyages took them to distant lands and gave them a fearsome reputation as pirates and raiders. We have evidence that Viking explorers traveled as far away as North Africa, present-day Russia, the Middle East, and North America. All of this travel made them a profoundly significant force in European history, and it's probably why their legend remains so widespread and infamous to the present day. It's also pretty much the only reason we know anything about the Vikings' own culture and beliefs. Though the Vikings had an alphabet and sometimes inscribed brief writings on rune stones, they were largely a verbal society without a real literary culture until Latin was introduced to Scandinavia along with Christianity in the late 11th century. Hey, they were seafaring people. It's hard enough lugging all your paperbacks to a new apartment. Imagine having to constantly load your entire Animorphs collection into a longboat. The primary information we have about the Vikings in the historical record comes from either their artifacts, dug out of the ground by archaeologists, or written accounts from the other cultures and societies with whom they were in contact. For example, the epic poem Beowulf, the inspiration for the accidentally terrifying Robert Zemeckis film, is set in Scandinavia in the 6th century, but was actually written down in Old English many years later. Okay, so we've been over who the Vikings were and how we know so much about them. But what about the parties? The Vikings actually had buildings, known as mead halls, built solely for the purpose of social gatherings. Typically, these massive structures were built on the estate of a powerful lord, often with a specific purpose or celebration in mind. They were presumably also really great for bingo nights. Some measured up to 50 meters in length, nearly half the size of a modern-day soccer field. Many Viking legends revolve around the construction of great new mead halls to honor particularly noted guests or royalty, giving a whole new meaning to the phrase, "This party is going to be legendary." One story, recounted by poet and historian Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, tells of a chieftain who invited the kings of both Norway and Sweden to stay with him on his estate. But when he asked the Norwegian king to stay in his most sumptuous and newly built mead hall, the Swedish king took great offense and had the chieftain bumped off. Nowadays, the king would simply write a strongly worded review. But back then, yelp was just the noise a chieftain made when you hit him with your axe. The mead halls were large, but they weren't necessarily stocked full of modern-day luxuries and conveniences. Chairs, for example, would have been relatively rare at the time, and thus reserved only for the wealthiest and most important guests at any particular gathering. Everyone else would have to make do with sitting on tables, benches, or even the ground. And it isn't really a party until you're completely out of places to sit, right? Another way to signify status during a party or other social event in Viking society was fashion. Most Viking clothing was practical in nature, with an emphasis on keeping the wearer warm and protected enough to survive the harsh Scandinavian climate. Parties provided an opportunity to mix things up and dress for style points rather than just survival. Men would wear gold belt buckles, while women favored brooches, necklaces, and other kinds of jewelry. Items raided or traded from other cultures, such as imported silk garments, were particularly sought after. The mead hall was so important in part because of the lengthy nature of some of these parties. These were not like modern shindigs, where you could show up fashionably late and then start planning a stealth goodbye by 9:30 to get home in time for the bachelor. No, even minor Viking feasts and festivals, such as the celebration that would follow a successful expedition or a wedding, would often last several days. Major feasts, like the one marking the arrival of the winter solstice, could last for up to 2 weeks. The subsequent hangover could last for much longer. We know that Vikings enjoyed live musical performances. Archaeologists have found a number of musical instruments on Scandinavian settlements, including flutes, hornpipes, and harps. But the intense music they produced wasn't for everyone. One surviving account of Viking culture was written by an Arab traveler named Ibrahim ibn Yaqub al-Tartushi, who traveled north from the then Muslim kingdom of Al-Andalus in Spain to a Viking settlement on the present-day German-Danish border. His writings give a lot of insight into the way Vikings were living at the time, including their music, which he did not care for. In his account, Ibrahim wrote, "I have never heard any more awful singing," and compared it to a groan that comes out of their throats, similar to the bark of the dogs, but even more like a wild animal. Sounds like the Vikings were really into mayhem. The band. The activity, too. Parties would also feature poetry readings from artists known as skalds, relating legendary epic stories of heroes undertaking great missions and going on adventures. Party games were popular as well, including dice rolling and even tabletop board games. Varieties here included an early version of chess and a strategy game known as Knefetavel, which likely translated to something along the lines of King's Table. Archaeologists have found a number of boards that were probably used for the game, but the actual rules have been lost to history. Just make something up. How hard could it be? There are also some historical accounts of a game called Flyding, which was essentially like a very early version of a rap battle. Teams of men and women took turns reciting impromptu poetry about their various adventures and exploits. These activities were also sometimes accompanied by drinking games or challenges, because, of course they were. For the outdoor Viking kids, some of the games were a bit more physical and intense. These included wrestling matches, stone lifting competitions, and even sword fights. A game called Hunutukasht involved Vikings throwing bones at one another, with the purpose of inflicting the maximum amount of pain possible. Swimming competitions included challenges to see who could hold their opponent's head underwater for the longest amount of time. Basically, it was a series of hold my mead events. Another game, called Togahonk, is not particularly well understood by historians, but was likely some kind of variation on tug-of-war. As best as we could figure, based on the scant information available, men would sit on the ground facing one another with their knees bent and their feet pressed together. Then they'd each pull on the ends of a rope while attempting to straighten their legs, ultimately flipping over their opponent. Or something. This interpretation of the game does not seem that far-fetched. We've seen similar feats of strength performed at modern weddings with an open bar. Due to the risk factor of some of these games, Viking feasts and parties had a somewhat higher casualty rate than a standard get-together. Like any great party, Viking celebrations largely revolved around food and refreshments. Guests would typically be offered an assortment of roasted meats, including poultry, beef, and horse. And while horse may sound a little intense for an hors d'oeuvre, or horse d'oeuvre, by the third day of non-stop drinking, you'd be shouting, "Pass the horse dip," just like Eric the Red. Side dishes included fruits and green vegetables cooked with butter. Vikings were also noted fans of alcoholic beverages, so beer, mead, and fruit wines would have been all steadily poured. Rounds of drinking would often be filled with toasts to kings, noble deeds, and the gods. Many Viking celebrations served a direct religious function. Large gatherings were in part designed to show deference to the gods and perform rituals that would keep them happy. So, guess Odin was really into that tug-of-war game? Many of these rituals took the form of what were known as blot sacrifices. These were direct exchanges with the divine, in which the Vikings offered an animal or animals to the gods to make a specific request, such as nice weather or good fortune in an upcoming battle. There were also at least 4 fixed rituals on the annual Viking calendar, aligned with the change in the seasons. Many different kinds of animals were used in these rituals, but horses were the most popular. This horse thing is starting to feel kind of personal. The animal's blood was spread on altars, the walls, and even the attendees, who would also usually eat the sacrificed critter. No sense in being wasteful. There are several historical accounts of Viking cultures including humans in their ritual sacrifice lineup. But remember what we said before about how most of what we know about the Vikings comes from the civilizations that were around them, rather than the Vikings themselves. That's important to bear in mind. A lot of people disliked or feared the Vikings, probably because of all the raiding and pillaging. So there's a reason to believe that some of the more bloodthirsty stories about Vikings may have been embellished. Christian writers in particular often employed horrifying stories about pagan cultures like the Vikings as a form of propaganda. One German bishop, Dietmar of Mersborg, describes Vikings meeting up every 9 years to atone for their evil deeds by offering the gods 99 humans, along with horses, dogs, hens, and hawks. Jeez, the boat ride to that meetup must have been loud as hell. This may or may not be true, but as a Christian outsider, Dietmar obviously didn't witness the ritual himself. It was either a second or third-hand account, or he made it up entirely. But it does sound like a heck of a party. Like most people of their era, Viking warriors were pretty superstitious, and so they often practiced magic battle rituals. These rituals entailed a number of practices. First, they would look for and interpret any possible omens and respond appropriately to each one. Then they would be sure to mark every one of their weapons that would be taken into battle with enchanting symbols. The symbols represented strength, luck, and courage. Finally, they would make battle sacrifices, which had to be strong animals such as boars, stallions, or bulls. It's hard to say how much these steps actually helped in battle, but they probably couldn't have hurt, so it's easy to see why they bothered. Every culture has its own standard of beauty, and the Viking rulers of the sea were no different. What were their standards like? Well, remember when you saw the Marvel superhero movie Thor, and the title character was portrayed as an Adonis with flowing blonde hair, and you thought that was just a Hollywood movie star thing? Well, it wasn't. While the mythological Thor was traditionally thought of as having red hair, Viking men tended to favor blonde locks. In fact, Viking men preferred blonde hair so strongly that they'd use harsh soaps with a high lye content to strip the hair of its natural color, effectively bleaching it. They would also dye their beards to match. These soaps also killed off head lice, so they accomplished 2 different hair treatments with one product, kind of like the OG Head & Shoulder shampoo and conditioner in one. Yule was a pagan winter festival that was traditionally observed by Germanic cultures. Modern academics believe it to be connected to the stories of the god Odin, the folkloric myth of the Wild Hunt, and the Anglo-Saxon event known as Modronit. When the Germanic pagans became Christians, the Yule celebration was Christianized as well. In fact, the Yule celebration included many customs now widely recognizable as elements of Christmas celebrations, like the familiar Yule log, wreaths, mistletoe, and the Yule tree, which is a forerunner of the Christmas tree. Another element of Yule, which wasn't adapted into a Christmas tradition, was human sacrifice. Every 9th year during the Yule celebration, it was customary for Swedish kings to sacrifice men at the temple of Uppsala. 9 heads would be offered to the gods, with the bodies hanging out in the temple's sacred grove. This would go on for 9 days, totaling 81 sacrifices that would be accompanied by feasts and Yule festivities. That story would make an interesting Christmas carol. In Norse literature, the blood eagle is described as a ritualized form of execution performed as a sacrifice to the god Odin. The ritual began with the restraint of the victim, who was face down, as the shape of an eagle with its wings outstretched was cut into his back. Each rib was then meticulously separated from the spine with a sharp instrument. Once all the ribs were detached, they were pulled outward to create the illusion of protruding wings. While still alive and in agony, the victim's lungs were then pulled from the gaping hole and set over his wings. This gave the illusion that his wings fluttered as he took his final breaths and died. Horrific sentences like the blood eagle were typically reserved to punish individuals without honor or to exact vengeance on a mortal enemy. Well, maybe they were. The catch here is that historians aren't quite certain whether this method was ever actually performed on anyone, or if it was just spread as a story to strike fear into the hearts of enemies, which seems like it would be pretty effective at. On the one hand, scholars of the age describe the ritual in such great detail that it's hard to believe it didn't happen. But on the other hand, there's no unambiguous historical evidence that anything like the blood eagle ever really happened. You might be thinking that Sex and Sacrifice is a Marcy Playground song that peaked at number 8 on the Billboard charts in 1997. But that was Sex and Candy. No. The sex and sacrifice we're talking about here is far, far more disturbing than that song. See, after the death of a chief, one of his slave girls would volunteer to join him in the afterlife. Volunteer being a relative term when slavery is involved. But regardless of how voluntary it really was, in order for her to participate, a very, very disturbing ritual had to take place first. To begin with, the girl was looked after and continuously intoxicated with various drinks, while cremation ceremony preparations were made. The girl would then partake in sexual rites, which is a euphemistic way of saying that she would have sex with every man in the village. We're guessing this custom might have been invented by a Viking dude. After that, she would be strangled. The village matriarch then stabbed her, and her body was placed with that of the chief on a wooden ship, set on fire, and sent out to sea. This ensured that she would serve her master forever in the afterlife. As disturbing as that sounds to modern ears, the sexual rites embodied the Viking way of transforming the chieftain's life force. For all intents and purposes, a draug is Norse mythology's version of what we would call a zombie. But it's not just any zombie, it's a big, brutal Viking zombie with fabulously lie-docked locks and a horrendous stench who likes to wreak havoc by murdering people, killing animals, and destroying property. It sounds pretty unstoppable, but there are actually several practices to prevent this being from rising. Hiding twigs in the clothing of the recently deceased is said to work. Placing an open pair of scissors on their chest or driving needles through the bottom of their feet ward off draugs as well. There were also ways to try and disorient the creature, which included lifting and lowering the coffin in 3 different directions and making sure the body's big toes were tied together. Sounds like cheap insurance against giant zombies. The bloat was a blood sacrifice to the gods to show gratitude, which is why it was performed publicly multiple times per year. The sacrifices were animals like horses and pigs, though they could also sometimes include prisoners of war. Typically, they would be sliced over an altar of stones. The meat would then be boiled in large cooking pits that could be indoors as well as outdoors. The participants would then sprinkle the collected blood, which was thought to have special powers, on walls, statues of gods, and sometimes even themselves. Some of that blood was also collected in a bowl and then passed around and sipped while chanting ensued. Blood, however, was not the only beverage available. Beer and mead were also usually consumed. Next, they'd pass around the carcass for more chanting, before dousing it with its own blood. Naturally, the level of gratitude correlated with the size of the kill. Berserkers were warrior shamans who were said to fight in a trance-like fury. But they had to undergo a symbolic death and rebirth to unlock their powers. To achieve this, they were put in dangerous situations in the wild and were expected to live as their totem animal would in the wilderness. Whether bear or wolf, they'd have to hunt and raid nearby towns as a beast would. They purposely stripped themselves of all humanity and morals to become barbaric on a physical and emotional level. They went berserk as beasts did on the battlefield, with no fear nor armor. Reports hold that these warriors would foam at the mouth, howl like animals, and even gnaw at the edges of their iron shields. Some of the sagas even held that berserkers had shape-shifting power that allowed them to literally change into bear form. One such shapeshifter is the legendary Bodvar Bjarki, a character from the saga of Hrolf Kraki, which dates to at least the 14th century. According to the saga, men saw that a great bear went before King Hrolf's men, keeping always near the king. He slew more men with his forepaws than any 5 of the king's champions. Interestingly, some scholars believe that Bjarki may be a cognate character to the English hero Beowulf, whose name means beewolf, which may be a kenning or poetic way of referring to a bear. That being said, Beowulf himself was not a shapeshifter, and the relationship between the two is ultimately unclear. Although the origins of the real-life berserkers, whose name means bear shirt and refers to the bearskins they would wear as coats, aren't known with certainty. Some evidence suggests they started out as a bear cult that was once fairly common in northern regions. As viewers who saw our video on Viking hygiene might recall, some recent findings suggest Vikings practiced decorative tooth modifications. About 24 skeletal remains from the Viking era have been discovered, with horizontal grooves purposely filed into the surfaces of the front teeth. No one knows exactly what the purposes of those grooves were. One theory holds that they may have indicated victories against opponents, like notches in a gun. An alternative theory suggests that the filings were meant to intimidate their enemies. It just made the guy look scary as hell. Also unknown is what tools the Vikings used to make the cuts in their chompers. Slightly more certain is that the cutting was done by a skilled practitioner, and individuals then probably used various dyes to color in the grooves. It's not fun to think about the daily life of the guy whose job it was to find creative uses for human urine. But someone did it. We know because Vikings discovered a way to turn their urine into fire. Yeah, you heard that right. This transmutation was accomplished by boiling a tree bark fungus, called touchwood, in a pot of urine for days. It was then pounded into a strip of felt-like material. Because of the sodium nitrate in urine, these fungus bombs smoldered rather than burned, enabling Vikings to take fire with them wherever they went. It was actually pretty ingenious, and for the times, it was incredibly useful. That being said, I'm glad someone invented matches.